We
are
cultivate.
cultivate.
We are cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay Valenti, and instead of my sister today, I will be joined by author Andrew Serra. Andrew Serra is a retired New York City fire captain and the author of Hell's 100 Acres, a new historical novel chronicling the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, the tragic fire of 1911, where 146 people died. Most victims were young immigrant women, and the fire was the catalyst for many of the workplace safety laws in place today. The book details the politics of the time and the complacency and greed that led to such a devastating loss of life. Serra is the author of several historical novels about topics as varied as the Italian Renaissance and the French Revolution. He is also the author of Finding John, his memoir about the 9/11 attacks, and his time spent at the World Trade Center collapse, rescue, and recovery. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we dive into the book specifically, how do you prepare to write a historical novel? Like, what do you do to prepare yourself for when you're writing a book?
I think it starts with usually reading something about it or learning something about either the time or a specific event that really grabs my interest, and then maybe thinking there might be a spark of an idea and then wanting to learn a little bit more about it.
So for listeners who are unfamiliar with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, can you describe the tragedy and tell why the effects of the fire are still relevant today?
You know, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, for those who are unfamiliar, in the early 20th century, a shirtwaist was a popular type of women's garment. Basically a white blouse, but, you know, maybe some decorative ruffling or like pleats around the shoulders. Very popular from right around the turn of the 20th century until about 1920. And at the time, the Triangle Waist Company was the name of the company. They were probably the most successful manufacturers of the shirtwaists. So it was a very large operation, and this particular factory was in a 10-story loft building, a very modern building for the era. It was a 10 stories, which was a skyscraper at the time, and they occupied the top 3 floors. And on a Saturday afternoon, not too long before closing time, a fire broke out on the 8th floor and ended up trapping hundreds of workers really on that floor and above, ultimately with no way out due to a number of factors that we can get into. But basically there was no way out, and 146 died. I want to say about 75 of them died from jumping out the 9th floor windows. So it was a very newsworthy event. There were hundreds and hundreds of spectators outside because it was a spring afternoon. It was near Washington Park, and it happened in full view of everyone. It was before cable news and social media, obviously, but it happened in real time in front of everyone. You know, there were many newspaper accounts. There were hundreds of witnesses that saw this, and they saw it unfold. When these people were on the 9th floor ledge. It sounds like it's pretty high up, but I've visited the building, and you stand there and you look up at the 9th floor windows and you realize, like, no, you could see their face. You can make eye contact with them. It was a very real, the humanity of the moment was just striking for so many people. Anyone who witnessed it, for the rest of their lives, they were forever changed by it. So it was a very, important event in that way because it did make such headlines. And there were so many other factors. Like I said, the Triangle Company was well known at the time because a little over a year before this fire, there had been a garment worker strike in New York City. And they call it the strike of the 20,000, but it ended up being more than 20,000 garment workers were on strike. And they fought for, better workplace better rules, better conditions, and better fire safety. And They made very, very modest gains, but the Triangle owners held out probably longer than any of the other owners. So they were known even before this fire. So there were so many factors that went into, that just little factors of the tragedy that just play into it.
Yeah, that just kind of compounded upon one another.
Yeah.
Now, how many of the varied people that you include in the novel are real people, and how many are based on real people but kind of fleshed out and changed a bit to kind of enhance the telling of the story?
As you'll see, that I think there's about maybe 5 or 6 real main characters that I follow, and then maybe some side characters built around them.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 main characters of the book, Charlie and Esther, are fictional characters. I've kind of built them to represent, the people who went through this, and their experiences. But all the others are real characters from the time. They didn't need to be invented. They were interesting enough in their own right, and so and the more I learned about them, the more I wanted to learn about them, the more I wanted to write about them, the good and the bad, as you saw with the owners.
What conditions, politically and economically, led to such a great loss of life at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire?
It was the perfect storm, really, to borrow the phrase. Industrialization, the Industrial Revolution had been in full swing for over a century at that point, really. And it vastly outpaced any kind of safety restraints that could keep up. Profit was always the leading decision maker. And factories were getting, more modernized, more mechanized, bigger operations, and more profitable in a lot of ways. And politics were changing too. In New York City, for example, in the 19th century, you had the what's called Tammany Hall. For people outside New York may not know, they were like a political club. They call it a political machine, actually. They were the de facto rulers of the Democratic Party in New York City for all of the 19th century, really, into the 20th century, and they ruled all levels of power in the city in a lot of ways. And the biggest, in the 19th century, their biggest source of power was patronage jobs. They would hand out civil service jobs and political appointees, and that's how they would garner votes. They were big amongst especially immigrant communities and poor, and they did actually do good and help people, but they wanted votes in return, and there was a lot of corruption, and there was they controlled everything. So comes the rise of the progressive era, the turn of the century, things start to change slowly. You have the rise of civil service reform in New York and other places, and now Tammany Hall can't dole out jobs, whether it's civil service jobs, police or fire, or political appointments. Now everything's controlled by a civil service commission. So now Tammany Hall needs a new source of power. So now they're trying to balance these two worlds. You have the progressive movement, which they had always kind of been on the side of the immigrant, the poor, the workers, but now they don't have their biggest source of power, patronage jobs. So now they need the business interests and the moneyed interest of the city. So you have these competing interests. So as the progressive era is heating up, they want change, but then they don't want it too fast because they have to keep business happy and they have to keep the workers happy, the Tammany leaders. So I think that might have stifled change that might have come quicker also, especially around the strike.
Can you describe for our listeners a bit of the history of firefighting in this country and how the system of responding to fires worked during this particular time in history?
So in this era, in 1911 in New York, and in many ways, New York was a leader at the time. They had a very forward-thinking leader named Edward Croker, who was the chief of the New York City Fire Department at the time. He had been the chief fire officer in New York City for over a decade by the time of this fire, and he was very well respected. A very interesting story. He came from a checkered background, but he rose up and he got a lot of things accomplished, and he also made changes in the fire department, made sure that they were the best equipped at the time, and were and disciplined and things like that. So in New York City, say, just about all fire trucks and engines at that time were horse-drawn. So this is just at the beginning of the motorized. In fact, there was only one motorized apparatus at the Triangle Fire. It was the first in the city. Engine Company 72 was there, but the rest were all horse-drawn. So basically, firefighters were in their firehouses around the city, and there was a telegraph system in place where an alarm box would be on corners all around the city, and somebody would pull a switch on this telegraph signal that would send a telegraph signal to a dispatcher, who would then ring a system of bells, and based on the number of bells rang, the members of local firehouses would know that A, it was their turn to respond, and B, what corner to respond to.
Sure.
So, maybe, not as quick as today, maybe with computer, 911 and computers and all, but actually very quick, even for back then. They were able to get to places quickly, and they, from the time of the alarm at the Triangle Fire, I think from the time the alarm was turned in, they arrived in less than 2 minutes. So
wow,
it did work as far as responding, and as far as these the equipment they had at the time, it would prove in a lot of ways to be ineffective. But there were some, at least from a firefighting point of view, there were some things that went right. The fire did go out fairly quickly from the time they were on the scene, even though it was a very large amount of fire. It's just that so many people were trapped so quickly that they didn't have a chance to save them. And the ladders at the time, that's probably the biggest impediment to saving more lives. The ladders at the time reached up to the 6th floor, whereas modern ladders would probably reach up to, maybe, depending on the circumstances, much higher, maybe the 9th floor, something like that, So they just weren't able to reach those windows. And they had safety nets at the time. I'm sure everyone's seen old films of firefighters holding a big round net and people jumping into. But those were designed for 3- and 4-story buildings, from a generation prior. And they weren't designed for skyscrapers. And the speed and the momentum of a body falling 9 floors, it wasn't capable of preventing injury and death, So they proved ineffective, really.
You mentioned a lot of newspaper coverage for this event because, as you said, it was during the day, like when everyone was out. It wasn't at night. So what did you learn about the people involved with and who were affected by the tragedy, like through all your research?
Well, I mean, speaking of newspapers, the one that stuck out, I came across very early was William Gunn Shepherd. He was probably at the time a lesser known, freelance newspaper journalist. He would later become much more famous. He became a famous World War I correspondent, combat correspondent. But at this time, he was just a freelancer. And, I kind of use him in my novel as like kind of an everything man. He's always in the right place to kind of give the reader a sense of, bringing the story along and fill the reader in on things going on. But he was fairly well known for the article he wrote about the Triangle Fire, because he happened to be in Washington Square Park that day, and when the fire broke out, and he, ran over and witnessed all of it, the worst of it, the people jumping and everything, and wrote a very moving, very powerful article about it, and in many ways very damning, because he knew about the strike and how the picketers, mostly women, had fought for change and really been stifled in many ways. And he was very, he finishes on a sour note, basically, an indictment of the people who basically pushed back against the strikers.
So in your opinion, had the Triangle Shirtwaist disaster not taken place, do you think anything would have changed regarding fire safety standards and procedures?
Not at that time. I think it would have happened eventually, probably after the next tragedy. It seems like just in modern history, I suppose, when it comes to firefighting and safety, I guess as with anything, the most change and the most important rules usually come on the heels of a tragedy. And I think there was complacency. Profits were good. There was no incentive to change anything. So without the political pressure that the notoriety of the fire brought, it would not have happened at that time. I think it would have happened significantly later.
Did your own experiences responding to fires, both following 9/11 and also as a firefighter, did that kind of shape how you researched and described the actions that were taken at the Triangle Fire?
For sure. I mean, for one thing, I wanted to get the fire scene right. The entire last section of the book is the fire. It's the central event of the book, obviously. So, and I really wanted to, there's been how many countless movies and portrayals of fires, and most firefighters will probably tell you they never really get it right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Hollywood, and it's I understand because they want it to be more dramatic and flame, but most fires you hardly see anything. It's just thick black smoke, and it's terrifying for different reasons. It's might not always make a good movie shot from being inside a large warehouse that's on fire where you might not see anything and you're crawling and you can feel the heat but you can't see it. So I really wanted to come at it from a different angle, maybe where a reader who hasn't been inside a building that's on fire, to try to give them a sense of how things, in some ways, they move very fast. Everything happens in a very constricted time frame, but there's definitely breakers in time where things happen, and you can describe how things are going in order and one thing after another. It's not just one little event like at this fire. There were many different time frames where the characters, where they become trapped in this area or maybe could have gotten out at that area, or little decisions here, or why, as the fire progresses, how things get worse for them. I wanted to try to use those descriptions almost as a tension builder for the reader to give them that sense of what it was like inside the building.
And just for clarification, so at this point in history, buildings that were larger than 3 or 4 stories, did they have fire escapes at this point?
For quite some time in the mid 19th century, fire escapes were required for multiple dwellings, for sure. Anywhere where apartments were. I know the number nowadays, it's more than 2 units, but back then I forget the exact number, but anything, say, more than 2 apartments is considered a multiple dwelling, and you need a secondary means of egress, they call it, another way out, and that would be a fire escape. And that was the way of addressing the secondary means of egress for over 50 years at that point in New York City, was to build a fire escape. And the first generations, the early generations of skyscrapers, many of them did have fire escapes. It's a little bit different construction type. Usually once you get over about 7 stories or higher, it's concrete and steel construction, not as much wood frame. So sometimes they can get around the fire escape requirements if there's isolated stairwells on different corners of the building that are enclosed, and they act as a fire escape as opposed to an exterior fire escape. The building where the Triangle factory was, they did have a fire escape in the rear, but that was only because the owner was trying to skirt a different rule. He had been told during the construction process that because of the floor space of the building, it was a very open floor space, a very big area, that he would need 3 stairwells accessing each floor to accommodate the number of people projected to be working on these floors. So rather than construct a 3rd stairwell, he slapped a probably hastily designed wrought iron fire escape on the back of outside the back windows, which proved to be a fateful decision on the fire, because not long after the fire broke out, with perhaps a dozen or 20 people on the fire escape collapsed. It just couldn't handle the weight. It wasn't really designed well.
Yeah.
So,
as you were researching the tragedy and writing the story, did you find yourself resonating with any of the people or characters that were involved in it?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. There were a number. The very initial start, was the fire company that I feature the most in the book. It's Hook and Ladder 20, which is actually the company where I worked when I was an
Oh,
active
really?
firefighter. So that's what attracted me initially to the story, and then that story kind of grew from there. Obviously, the Triangle Fire was one of the biggest events in that firehouse's history, so that's how it grew from there. So I kind of knew that I was going to be interested in those characters going in.
Mm-hmm.
I think the two biggest surprises was Edward Croker, as I mentioned before, the fire chief. Very interesting. He was, as I said before, Tammany Hall and their grips on city power and the corruption of the 19th century. He was in many ways a product of that. He was appointed to the fire department by his uncle, who was a bigwig with Tammany Hall, and there were, accusations of nepotism that hounded him early in his career. But he was a dedicated civil servant. He was a professional, and he was good at his job, and he was loyal, and he worked his way up on it, and made himself a very respected fire chief. So I found that to be very interesting. He was, by the time of the fire, he was like this media, almost like, the newspapers always followed him around for a quote. He had that
Yep.
gravitas in the city. So I think that was a little bit of a surprise. I had heard of Chief Croker. All in New York City, all firefighters have. He's a famous figure among the fire department, but I had heard of him, but I didn't realize how interesting I would find his character and his story.
Sure.
So that was the first surprise, and I think the second was the seamstresses themselves. I really became engrossed in their stories. There's a lot of material out there, survivor accounts and interviews that are available, and I really just became engrossed in their stories. And almost all of them were very recent immigrants to the United States. They had dealt with so many hardships even well before that day, and escaped terrible conditions and violence and poverty in their old countries, and come here with nothing, and worked under very long days under very hard conditions, and crammed into tenements with extended families, and they had such interesting and hard and varied lives up until that point. And then the ones who died to be cut down like this at such a young age, or the ones who survived, even for all the hardships they'd lived through, they kept that that day with them for the rest, well into their 80s and 90s. They were telling the story of that day. I found that very moving. That their stories were really, really captivating.
It reminded me very much of the lives of the people working in the meatpacking industry in the jungle. It reminded me a lot of very similar struggles, obviously a very different industry, but similar as far as the types of injuries you had to be wary of. Like, you had to worry about, loss of fingers or fires, as we discovered in the book and in real life. But it wasn't simple, easy work. It was very like long hours and backbreaking work, and not the best conditions, especially starting in tenements. Like, many of these women that were working at the factory had been working in like apartment building type situations
Right.
prior to this. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize
Right.
either.
And we tend to lump them all together now with the term sweatshop,
Mm-hmm.
but the Triangle Factory really wasn't a sweatshop by the true definition of where the word comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It really comes from really the years before, where in tenements, in these apartments, basically very small time operators would set up with just like 4 sewing machines, usually foot pedal powered, facing each other, with in very dark, cramped conditions, with stacks of fabric all around. And they were basically like independent contractors, and they would have runners bringing garments and material to a central point somewhere in the neighborhood and come back, and they were going from before sunrise till after sunset, because they were paid by the garment company by the unit, by the garment they produced, and they in turn turned around and paid the seamstresses by each garment. So
Mm-hmm.
so they would basically, even though it was a hot sweaty condition where they're working. That's not the term referred to sweating the workers, like you were sweating as much as you could get out of them in a day. You know how many garments you could get in a day. So when a lot of the women, they speak of being happy to move up to the Triangle factory. It was this big loft with big high ceilings and windows all around, all four sides with open windows and fresh air and light all day long. And it was definitely a step up as far as just ambiance and environment and all that stuff, even though it was still long hours, grueling work. But it was seen, looking through the lens of what had come before, it was considered a step up.
Yep.
And in some ways that might have hindered, even the strikers because I think the owners felt like, well, what are they complaining about? It was much worse when I started, So there was kind of a little bit of that attitude, I think.
Yeah, like what more can we give you? We've got all this space now, and you've got light.
Exactly, and a job. If they had the attitude like, well, if you don't like it, there's, I have 15 people outside dying, that would love your seat, So
Yep.
it wasn't that hard to be cavalier for the owners in that position,
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned before, I think, with the workers and the very long days and like same thing in the meat packing industry or the garments, and I think one of the things I wanted to try to capture in this book was it's very easy to. You look back at the workers, and whether it's the garment industry or any factories at the time, and just see them as a worker, just as a nameless. Like all of them have stories. They have a very hopes and dreams, and with this fire in particular, 146 dead. It sounds like a statistic. It doesn't, but it's 146 individual tragedies. That's 146 families that were devastated, and like, I showed them like the two sisters, working near each other, 10 minutes before they're giggling to each other like sisters do, they had, all the same range of emotions we have today. And all of that is, it's easy to forget looking back through history of people, especially people with hard lives like that, to remember that they're not so different than us,
Yep. Yeah, like before the fire broke out, the main character, or one of the main characters, she was trying to rush out the door for a date, and she was really excited about that. And then next thing you know, tragedy strikes. And I think you do a beautiful job of going through and kind of, as you said, like showing the people in the book as people, like setting the stage as far as I'm blanking on it. Is it Charlie is the name of the main?
Yeah.
Charlie. How he has his connections to Tammany Hall, and how he's bucking against that, and he's doesn't like the machinations that are going on in the background, but then discovers, like maybe this is where I'm meant to be. Like maybe this is the work that I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm blanking on her name too. Why am I blanking on her name?
Esther,
thank you. And how she's like, they're trying to pull her in to talk more because there's talk of another strike, and there's all these things going on, and they want her to be the voice of Triangle, and she's like, I can't do that. Like, I can't afford to lose my job or have my sister potentially lose her job being associated with me. So there's like all these little intricate details behind the scenes that paint the larger picture of just what this event meant to so many people that were affected by it. And I think you did a really great job sort of painting that picture before we even get to the tragedy.
Well, thank you. I hope, that was really how I approached it with that in mind, knowing, it's like the analogy that's come up a lot of times, like the film Titanic. Like,
yes,
we know where this is going, right?
Yep.
We all know the thing, it's, we know, a book about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, we know how it ends, but, I think it's interesting to talk about, well, how did we get there? and what
Yep.
happens, and where do we go from there,
Yep.
and so, and there were a lot of different lives from all different walks of life intersected at that fire, rich and poor alike.
I think something that a lot of readers probably don't know about the victims is it wasn't just the garment workers, it was the elevator operators. It was, the foremen that were
Right.
working there as
There were
well. Like
skilled
it was
workers, cutters. There were, sales associates on the top floor, and shipping agents and receptionists and everybody.
there's one part that sticks out to me and when I read it, I had to put the book down for a second because it just hit me so viscerally. Your description of the first victim hitting the ground. And I just I don't know what it was about that description, but it just I'm tearing up thinking about it. It just hit me how terrifying of an event this would have been for these people and knowing that they're trapped and there's nothing they can do and nowhere they can go. And you do such an amazing job of explaining that panic that they would have felt, and not just the victims themselves, but the onlookers. I can't
Right.
fathom being on the sidelines and seeing this happening and having no way to help, no way to do anything, and just being witness to this. And that's why I'm so glad that we have all this coverage about this. And I'm not glad that it happened, but I am glad that a lot of good came from it. That it wasn't just one of those, oh, we're just gonna, thoughts and prayers type of thing. We're just gonna
Yeah.
shoot under
It
the
definitely
rug.
spurred action, and the credit goes to some of the people I talk about in the book, and union activists and some very dedicated politicians, and first and foremost, I think mostly the seamstresses, but others also who were in the building, but who just they didn't just kind of just crumple up, and they took this as to make sure that they didn't die in vain. They kept their memory alive. They fought. They in a lot of ways. I think it's not. This isn't. I've heard it before from other writers, and that in many ways, I think the New Deal is, if you want to say, well, the New Deal era, which is a generation later in the 1930s.
Mhm.
Where did that start? It's not an exaggeration to say it started at the Triangle Fire. In a lot of ways, some of the biggest players in the New Deal came from the aftermath of the Triangle Fire, who I talk about in the book, mostly Al Smith and Francis Perkins. Al Smith
Mhm.
was the governor of New York, and in his own presidential campaign, was nominated by a young politician who was just returning to the scene after recovering from polio, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So
Mhm.
he nominated Al Smith at the Democratic Convention for president, and he was in a lot of ways Al Smith's. He was a protege of Al Smith, and you see the progressive era starting to coalesce at that time, and then Frances Perkins, becomes the first female cabinet secretary in U.S. history. She becomes
Mhm.
Secretary of Labor, and basically she earned, she built up a reputation of fighting for workers and for improved conditions from before the Triangle Fire even. But so you see the leaders of the New Deal starting to coalesce right around this time. And the labor unions really starting to kick into high gear, whereas before there were unions obviously from the 19th century, but there was mixed results, I think. And
Mhm.
even I think amongst the public at large, there was ambivalence towards them. Some people supported, some people thought unions were just troublemakers. So,
Yep.
but once you have this fire, you see, I think public opinion starts to change.
Mhm. The Triangle Factory, Shirtwaist Factory, was run by 2 men, and one of them who was directly affected by it decides to, change his ways, but then the other one is like, "No, I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing."
Yeah, they're very interesting characters. I focus more on one, Max Blanck, more than the other,
Yep.
just to keep the story moving a little bit, and and there's a little bit more known about him, so it was. But I think historians have gone back and forth on. Everyone agrees that they're probably the most guilty of anybody.
Yep.
They locked one of the exits. We haven't really said that yet, but a lot of people know one of the exit stairs were locked
Yep.
on the floor, and that was the policy of the factory. That was by design. They were put on trial afterwards, and they had the best lawyer money could buy at the time, and they were acquitted. It was a strange case because everything hinged on whether or not they could prove that they knew the door was locked, and I think this fancy lawyer was able to make some of the witnesses. You got to remember, a lot of the witnesses spoke English as a second language. They were,
Yep.
So he was able to basically win points on, with these witnesses on the stand and discredit them enough to create doubt. And they were acquitted. They were charged with manslaughter because there wasn't a lot to charge them with. There weren't very many safety laws at the time that they had broken, but it was illegal to lock the exit door, but they couldn't prove that they knew it was locked, even though it's pretty much agreed, by historians that they did know. But as I hinted before, they were immigrants themselves. They started with nothing, working in the sweatshops, and worked their way up. They were men with families who, and it could have been easy just to write a story where they're the monster, the epitome of evil.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's rarely ever true in life, right? These are two men who made decisions for a number of reasons, and I try to I in no way make an apology for their decision.
Sure.
I think I try to show them that the decisions that why they made the decisions and the greed and all of that. But I tried to just give them some more depth, to humanize them a little bit, because I think that's more to true life, right? It's
Yep.
even terrible decisions are made for a variety of different reasons, or people arrive at them in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you that there are very few people that start out evil. And I feel like, kind of to your point, they may have had the best of intentions with some of the things they were doing, while also, on the other hand, still making some decisions that weren't on the up and up and were more in their favor than other people's. But I wouldn't categorize them as overly malicious, if that makes sense. Like, I know that they were upset with the unions. They were fighting tooth and nail to not have to meet all of the demands that were made for them, to like all the changes that were requested to be made, and they made the minimum that they had to do. They were like, we'll do it, but we're not going to give you everything that you want.
One of the irony is one of the few fire safety rules they did follow was not permitting smoking on the factory floor. That was always a no at the Triangle factory. And the irony is the best most investigators came to the conclusion that the fire probably was started by smoking, a cigarette, carelessly, discarded cigarette, either cigarette butt or match on the 8th floor. So it's, for all the safety rules they skirted and complained about and blocked and fought against, the one they did follow, they ended up biting them,
Yeah.
So it's just another, one of those ironies and sad and strange facets of this fire.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about Hell's 100 Acres?
I think we touched on it before. I think the reason why I love historical fiction and working in this genre is, times change and circumstances change and customs and everything, but I think there's a common bond, of humanity that just across generations and centuries and decades, and people are people. From we've always, in a lot of ways, we wake up in the morning with the same hopes, the same dreams for our lives or our families or our loved ones. And I think you can learn a lot about ourselves or our own times, and just by trying to look at history through the eyes of someone from the past.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, more so even than just reading a straightforward nonfiction history book. The facts of what happened, as opposed to creating, making it human. And the emotions of what it was like to be there.
And I mean, you saw me. I was like tearing up and weeping a little bit. I do think that humanistic element is important in sharing stories like this, because it's easy to be detached from a story when it's more just factual, where you're just kind of like just reading facts about an event like this. Whereas if you're reading about it from the viewpoint of someone who experienced it and lived it, and to your point, being able to write it as a fire actually takes place, like to actually know and understand how a fire actually works, to be able to more accurately describe just what they would have experienced and gone through, makes it that much more real, as opposed to the Hollywood spin on what a factory fire might have looked like at that period in history. As we start to kind of wind down the interview, would you mind taking a few moments to tell us about the other books that you've written and the processes you went through to research them?
Sure. I've been writing, I've loved writing my whole life. I've always loved creating stories. I really got serious about it, not full time, obviously. I was still working with the fire department at the time, but in 2012, I published my first novel. It was a historical novel. The Dead Florentines was the title. It was about the Italian Renaissance. So, and like most of my books, it's whatever I'm studying or learning about at the time captures my interest, and I dive into it. I was studying Italian at the time, so
Okay.
so especially much of the great literature of the Italian language comes from this period, and I was just drawn into it and started reading more about it and wanted to write about it, and that's how I went from there. And same thing a couple of years later with French. I just enjoy learning languages, and started being interested in the French language, and then decided to write about the French Revolution in 2015 was my next book. And then from there, I that's where I took a little detour into nonfiction. After being a firefighter and being a writer, people had asked me over the years. I said, "Oh, are you ever going to write about 9/11? I think maybe you would have something to write about there, being a writer." And I always said no up until then. I didn't think I could. I think
Sure.
I didn't feel like I could put myself in the right mind, or I didn't know if I could approach it in a way that would make sense of what anything I would want to say. But
Sure.
Right around maybe 2015, 2016, I was home one day and I decided, you know what, I just gave it a crack, and I wrote one chapter just to start of. And I decided, I said, you know what, it wasn't too bad. I think I can go from here. And then that's where I dove into it and started doing research. And it was a memoir. I call it like memoir / investigative history of 9/11 and my experiences. And that came out in 2018. It was called Finding John. So, and then from there back to fiction. So that's been my experience. And we'll see. I love historical fiction, like I was saying before, but maybe nonfiction if the right story presented itself. I think I could go there too.
Kind of given his place in the book, would you ever consider learning more about Croker and diving more into him?
Yeah, he would be. I think that would be a great story. There are actually some books and articles, and he is a. Like I said, amongst firefighters, and almost every fire academy across the country probably has a part of their curriculum is dedicated to Chief Croker. He gave a very famous speech It's in the book. I have no ambition but one, but to be a fireman. That's pretty well known. And yeah, I think he was very captivating, very charismatic in a lot of ways, but also very human.
Mm-hmm.
Like not the knight in shining armor, but like the flawed father figure in a lot of ways.
Yep.
It's I found him to be very, very, very interesting.
Just picturing him getting in his automobile as he's putting on his goggles and flying down the streets from firehouse to fire. That was always an amusing image in my head of him.
Yeah, he was famous. He had the first automobile in the fire department, so he would get there first in a lot of times.
He sounded like a very interesting character. Like he would be an extremely fun person to have a drink with. We'll just say that.
Yeah, and I actually got a lot of material on him. The New York City Fire Department up at the Fire Academy, they have a library called the Manned Library, and there's a number of volunteers that work there. They're very dedicated and knowledgeable, and they were great. They had files of material on Croker, handwritten letters and material back
Wow.
over a century old, and just a lot of great stuff there for to put together a story. And like I said, a lot of it, the story kind of told itself.
Yep,
His life was that interesting.
for sure. I would like to thank Andrew for joining me today. And before we go, can you tell our listeners where they can find you on social media and where they can purchase a copy of Hell's 100 Acres?
Yeah, you could go to my website, andrewserra.com. All the links there for social media at Andrew Serra Author, for Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. And the books are, wherever you can, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and wherever you can find books online. The books for sale. So.
Well, thank you again for making time to talk to me today. And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and we'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.
Thank you, Lindsay.